some are born in chains. The people who gave you life are the very ones who hold you captive, giving you existence, but never allowing you to live for yourself. If it were you, would you spend your entire life being a puppet, or would you risk everything to break free? To make matters worse, Lykan didn't fall for just anyone. He fell for Sonia, the daughter of the vampire elder, Victor. One is a slave, the other is heir to the throne. One is destined to bow, the other is born to rule. If you were Sonia, and your father ordered you to kill the person you loved, would you uphold your family's honor, or betray your entire kind? This isn't just a simple tale of werewolf revenge. It is the story of a slave who, for the first time, held his head high and carved the word freedom into the heart of the night. Long ago, when darkness reigned over the earth, the bloodline of Corvinus split into two. The vampires possessed wisdom, power, and immortality, while the Lycans, the other branch, spread through the wilderness like a plague. They were savage, bloodthirsty, and unable to return to human form. If a Lycan bit a human, the curse would continue to spread. It was in this era that Victor rose to power. He established a stronghold for the vampires, trained an army of bloodsuckers, and used high walls, iron gates, and silver weapons to protect their world. The nobility offered him tribute, human slaves toiled for him, and the vampires hid in the shadows, reveling in the order he created. But Victor knew well that his greatest headache wasn't the humans who wept and knelt at his feet. It was the wolves outside the walls that could never be fully extinguished. Then, a life appeared that should never have existed. A female werewolf gave birth to a child. This child didn't crawl on all fours like a common beast, nor was he trapped in animal form. He had the appearance of a man, the strength of a wolf, and a level of focus and rationality more terrifying than any predator. Every fiber of Victor's being told him to kill the child, to end it before it truly began. But Victor didn't strike. Instead, he saw a gold mine. The child's name was Lykan, the first true Lycan. His blood could create a new race, creatures with the strength of werewolves, the intellect of humans, and the ability to walk in the daylight. To the vampires, he was a heaven-sent army of slaves. So, Victor kept Lykan and raised him, not out of love, but out of utility. He forced Lykan to use his blood to infect human slaves, turning them into Lycans. Then, he fitted them with silver collars, making them guard the gates by day and tear apart their enemies by night. This was the order the vampires spoke of. They turned slaves into weapons, then locked the weapons back in their cages. Years later, Lykan grew into Victor's most effective weapon. He could charge into a pack of mindless, savage werewolves and slaughter them. He could bow his head and call Victor master. Every vampire could see that Victor favored him, even claiming that Lykan was like a son to him.
The nobles are upset, my lord. William's pestilence has not been checked. Werewolves have killed their slaves.
Humans upset. Tanis, please, take a note of what pain that brings me.
Yet their lost slaves means our lost silver.
Enough! Have I not increased our holdings tenfold since Marcus and Amelia took their sleep? We will deal with the wolves as we always have.
The problem is, sons aren't kept on a leash. The collar around Lykan's neck was a constant, stinging reminder that no matter how many battles he won, how many lives he saved, he would never be one of them. One word from his master, and he was forced to his knees. But in that cold fortress, there was one who refused to see him as just a slave. Her name was Sonia, Victor's daughter, a member of the Vampire Council and the future heir to his throne. Unlike the other aristocrats, she didn't care for courtly politics or hiding behind the guard. She rode out on patrol, faced the wolves head-on, and even defied her father's orders to save others. Victor, of course, was displeased. He wanted Sonia to learn cold, calculating power and absolute loyalty to the family and to him. In Victor's eyes, power isn't maintained by kindness. There are beasts outside the castle walls and beasts within the council chambers. An heir cannot afford a weakness. Yet, Sonia's greatest weakness was Lykan. The two fell in love in the shadows. It wasn't a noble flirtation or a reckless impulse. It was a bond forged in the constant terror of discovery and execution, yet they refused to let go. Lucian showed her a key he had secretly fashioned, a key that could unlock his collar. To anyone else, it was just a scrap of metal from the forge. To Lucian, it was freedom. He asked Sonia if she would leave with him if he escaped. Sonia was terrified, for she knew exactly what her father was capable of. If Lucian fled, the vampires would hunt him down like a rabid animal. She begged him not to use the key, but Lucian had reached his limit. He wasn't naive to the danger. He simply refused to live like an animal for another day. Then, disaster struck. A group of human nobles, traveling to the vampire stronghold, was ambushed by a pack of feral Lycans. Defying her father's orders, Sonia led a detachment to protect them. But the wolves were relentless, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Inside the castle, the vampires watched the slaughter outside, too afraid to open the gates. Lucian knew he was bound by his collar, and he knew it was strictly forbidden, but he begged them to let him out. He knew better than anyone that these wolves weren't his kin. They were mindless monsters that would tear everyone apart. If they waited any longer, Sonia would die. No one would open the gate. So, Lucian took off the collar himself. In that moment, he wasn't Victor's slave, he wasn't a vampire's guard, and he wasn't a pet allowed to survive at his master's whim. By any measure, saving the daughter of an elder should be rewarded. But in Victor's world, rules matter more than lives, and obedience matters more than merit. Even after saving Sonia, Lucian was punished for removing his collar. 30 lashes. One by one, they tore across his back. Victor sneered that he had once considered him a son, but there was no fatherly love in his voice, only the rage of a master offended by his slave. Lucian finally struck back with the truth. You gave me life, but you gave me chains. Victor was never a creator. He was simply a slave owner. He kept Lucian, not out of mercy, but out of greed. He birthed the Lycan race not to give them a future, but to ensure that the vampires could command their own claws to rule the light of day. After the flogging, Lucian was thrown into the dungeons. The other Lycans watched him, some with pity, some with fear, and some with the hollow gaze of those who had long ago surrendered their spirits. The vampires fed them, but forced them to lick their meals from the floor like dogs. They granted them life, but forced them to tear each other apart beneath the lash. Looking at his kin, Lucian finally stood among them, not as their master, but as their brother. He told them, "We are not beasts." He wasn't roaring at the vampires, he was roaring at the Lycans themselves. Because the most tragic form of slavery isn't the chain around your neck, it's the day you believe you deserve nothing more than to be a dog. Lucian needed them to understand. They were not toys for the vampires, not pets for Victor, and certainly not beings born to be struck, insulted, or sacrificed. They had a choice. They could remain slaves, or they could become Lycans. Meanwhile, Sonia knew there was no turning back. Victor wouldn't spare Lucian just because he had saved her. In fact, he intended to execute him as soon as the human nobles departed. Sonia had no choice but to turn to Tanis. Tanis was a schemer. He had known about Sonia and Lucian's secret all along, keeping silent not out of kindness, but waiting for the moment his silence would be most valuable. When Sonia finally came to him, he made his move. He wanted a seat on the council. To save Lucian, Sonia agreed to surrender her own. With Tanis's help, Sonia entered the dungeon. She told Lucian that when the sun rose and the vampires entered their daylight slumber, it would be his only chance. They would meet at the riverbank at sunset, 3 days later. Lucian begged her to come with him, but Sonia chose to stay. She believed that because she was Victor's daughter, as long as Lucian escaped, she could find a way to slip away later. But she underestimated her father, and she overestimated the bonds of blood. At dawn, Lucian made his move. He didn't just look out for himself. He bit several human slaves, turning them into Lycans. He knew it sounded like a curse, but in that world, there was no future as a human slave, and no future as a vampire's servant. Becoming a Lycan, at the very least, offered the power to fight back. He led those willing to take the risk out of the cells, breaking shackles and releasing his kin. Chaos erupted in the castle. As the Lycans fled through the tunnels, vampire guards rained down crossbow bolts and silver blades. Not everyone made it out. Some fell, others were forced to stay behind, and Lucian had to grit his teeth and leave them. He promised those he couldn't save that he would come back. This wasn't an empty comfort. It was a declaration of war against the entire vampire world. After escaping the castle, Lucian didn't go into hiding. He led a small band of Lycans to raid the estates of the nobility, seizing weapons and liberating slaves. He was no longer just a fugitive. He was turning freedom into an uncontrollable wildfire. Victor soon realized the situation was far worse than he had imagined. Lucian was gone, the armory had been raided, the Lycan slaves were liberated, and the nobles were in a state of panic. Council members like Koloman pressured Victor to hunt down his pet, but Victor remained cold and calculated. He wasn't worried. He knew Lucian would return. He held the one thing Lucian could never abandon: Sonia. Victor began to probe his daughter. He played the part of the grieving, understanding father, mentioning Lucian's betrayal and his own deep disappointment. Sonia tried to deny helping Lucian, but Victor was no ordinary father. He was a vampire who had lived for ages. He bit into Sonia's neck, reading the truth in her blood. In that instant, he ceased to be a father. He became the elder of the coven. Sonia confessed that she loved Lucian. To a human father, that might have been a daughter's heartfelt secret. To Victor, it was treason, an insult, and the ultimate humiliation. A vampire heir yielding her soul to a beast. He couldn't accept it. Sonia was placed under house arrest. The castle transformed into her prison. At the riverbank, Lucian waited. Sunset passed, and Sonia did not appear. Rays warned him it might be a trap. The other Lycans didn't trust a vampire woman. After all, no matter how much she helped, her blood still belonged to Victor. But Lucian believed in her. He told Rays that while these men followed him on the surface, they were truly following the concept of freedom. Freedom was the bond that united them. If he didn't return, Rays was to lead them forward. This was a pivotal moment. Lucian was no longer just a lover or a fugitive. He knew he might die in that castle, but he also knew that this rebellion could not rely on him alone. If freedom belonged only to Lucian, it was fragile. If it belonged to every Lycan, then Victor could never chain it again. But love demanded his return. Lucian infiltrated the castle and finally reunited with Sonia. For a brief moment they embraced, stealing a final spark of warmth in the cold dark. Sonia told him, "You are free." Lucian replied, "Without you, I am not free at all." They tried to flee, but Victor had already cast his net. Sonia was forced to face her father. She didn't want to kill Victor, nor did she want to conquer him. She only begged him to call off the hunt. Then, She revealed the secret that would change the destiny of both species. She was pregnant. It was the union of vampire and werewolf blood. Sonia called it a miracle. She had hoped that her father would at least stay his hand for the sake of the child. She believed that no matter how cold Victor was, he would hesitate for even a second before his own grandchild. But Victor did not. In his eyes, this was no miracle. It was a monstrosity. He cursed the day Sonia was born, and he cursed the hybrid life that should never have existed. In that moment, Sonia finally saw the truth. Victor never loved the real her. He only loved the obedient, pure-blooded daughter who could inherit his power. The moment she defied the laws of the coven, she ceased to be a daughter. She was merely a criminal. Lucian and Sonia were captured. Victor could have handed Lucian over to the council to appease the nobility and swept the truth about Sonia under the rug, but it was too late. With Sonia carrying a Lycan child, the council could not pretend they didn't know. The trial began. Sonia stood before the vampire lords as the charges were laid out one by one. Treason, consorting with beasts, aiding a prison break, and tainting the bloodline. She had been a member of the council, a warrior, and a savior of her kind. But today, those honors meant nothing. Her greatest crime was not falling in love with Lucian. It was proving to the vampires that the beasts they despised were capable of being loved. The council voted. One by one, they cast their votes for execution. Someone reminded Victor that she was his daughter. After a moment of silence, Victor cast his own vote. Guilty. This is the most bone-chilling part of the film. It wasn't that Victor didn't know who Sonia was. He knew perfectly well. And it was precisely because he knew that he had to be the one to kill her. A tyrant's greatest fear is not rebellion from his enemies, but proof from within his own house that his order is built on a lie. Sonia was led into the execution chamber. Lucian was shackled, forced to watch his beloved walk toward the sunlight. Vampires fear the sun, and Victor chose to use it to execute his own child. This was no mere killing. It was a public declaration. No one, not even an elder's own flesh and blood, could survive defying the vampire law. Lucian struggled, roared, and begged, but the chains held him fast. He had saved Sonia once, but he could not save her again. He could only watch as the sunlight poured in, watching Sonia look toward him in her final agony. She didn't blame him. She told Lucian that she was there by her own choice, not his. She told him that he had never let her down. Lucian met her gaze, urging her to look at him, and they exchanged their final vows of love. Then, Sonia vanished into the light, her and her unborn child consumed by the fire, leaving only ash. Some deaths break a man, others awaken him. Sonia's death burned away the last remnants of illusion in Lucian's heart. He might have once believed that Victor would show mercy, that he would value his daughter, or that he might one day acknowledge that the Lycans were not mere beasts. Now, he knew better. The vampire castle would never grant a slave freedom, and Victor's throne would never yield to love. If you don't want to be chained, you cannot beg on your knees. Lucian exploded. He broke his restraints, transformed into a Lycan, and tore his way out of the execution chamber. He didn't flee. He went to set the others free. The Lycans who had been kept in the shadows, whipped, and used as tools, finally saw their moment. He asked them, "Do you want revenge?" Their response was no longer downcast silence. It was a thunderous roar. The Lycans charged from their cages, launching a counterattack against the vampires. For years, they had been day-guarding slaves, the very tools Victor used to protect his fortress. Now, those tools were pointed at their master's throat. The vampires finally realized that their most dependable weapon had become their most lethal enemy. Lucian lunged at Victor. The master and the son he had created finally stood on a true battlefield. Victor accused Lucian of defiling his daughter and causing Sonia's death. Lucian did not back down. He simply stated that he loved her. Victor, consumed by hatred, spat that he should have crushed Lucian's skull the day he was born. Lucian's reply was calm. "You should have, but you didn't." That sentence cut deeper than any roar. Because Victor had spent his life calculating, controlling, and manipulating, yet in the very beginning, he had kept Lucian alive. He thought he had created a slave, a weapon, a dog to guard the gates. Instead, he had raised the first of the Lycans, the spark for the war that would burn for centuries to come. Lucian did not claim victory that day. Sonia was dead, their child was gone, and only a few had escaped. The vampires remained, Victor lived, and the long night was far from over. But one thing had changed forever. The Lycans no longer believed that chains were their destiny. In the past, they were forced to bow in the castle. Now, they knew they could snap the iron links. In the past, they were called beasts. Now, they would prove through war that the true beasts are sometimes the ones sitting on the throne. At the end of the film, this ancient grudge connects to the story of Celine. She once believed that werewolves had killed her family, so she became a death dealer to hunt them down. But the truth was that Victor, the father figure she served, was the one who destroyed her life. He kept her only because she reminded him of Sonia. That is Victor's most pathetic and hateful trait. He murdered his own daughter only to search for her shadow in another girl. He feared hybrids, feared betrayal, and feared the collapse of his family order. Yet every lie he built eventually became the blade that pierced his own heart. Lucian lost Sonia and his unborn child, but Sonia did not die in vain. Through her choice, she taught the Lycans that they were not born to bow. Through her death, she showed the world that purity and honor can be so cruel that they devour even blood and family. So, when Lucian says that this is only the beginning, it isn't an idle threat. It is the birth of history. From this day forward, the Lycans are no longer just monsters in the night, and the vampires are no longer just aristocrats behind high walls. Two races, born of the same blood, are forever cast into war by slavery, betrayal, love, and death. If you asked Lucian, was it worth it? He likely wouldn't answer. He never wanted war. He only wanted to break his collar, take Sonia, and live where there were no masters, no slaves, and no blood trials. But Victor blocked that path. So Lucian had no choice but to live another way. By turning his grief into a flag, Sonia's death into a flame, and leading every broken Lycan out of the depths, so that for the first time, they could shout their own names. They are not beasts, they are Lycans. And this war began the moment a slave fell in love with a princess, and the moment a father chose to execute his own child. So, the question returns. If you were Sonia, would you choose your family, or the one the world calls a beast? If you were Lucian, would you flee with your freedom, or turn back to save the one who might lead you back into chains? The film provides a cruel answer. Freedom is not something gifted by others. Love is not something won by begging. When power leaves you with nowhere to turn, the fangs of the beast become your final dignity.